Hello everyone and welcome to Religion Reconsidered. My name is Jack Fernan and today on the show we are continuing and concluding our three-part series on Julian of Norwich. And to do so, we're joined by Dr. Claire Gilbert. Now, Dr. Gilbert is the current director of the Westminster Abbey Institute in London. And so before we got into our conversation about Julian, we first discussed the work of the Westminster Abbey Institute and how it aims to bring a level of moral discernment to the work of the UK public sector. We also spoke about Claire's career and her work in bringing ethical standards to medical research during the 80s and 90s in the UK. We then made a pivot to talk about Claire's spiritual life, and she recounts her religious journey as a child and how she came to discover and love Julian of Norwich during her theology degree at university. Julian then went from being a subject of study to being a spiritual guide and friend, as Claire went through grueling cancer treatment that led her to write her most recent book, I, Julian, which is a fictional autobiography of Julian's life. The conclusion that Claire takes away from her lifetime's work with Julian of Norwich is an idea of porosity, whereby we engage with the world and each other with receptive understanding as we listen and learn with openness and compassion. Now, before jumping into the show, just a reminder to share this podcast with your friends, family, colleagues, or anyone else who you think would enjoy it. It really does help when the word gets spread around. Also, if you haven't already done so, head on over to our Instagram page where we've got some extra photos and clips for you there. Now, without further ado, thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. Dr. Claire Gilbert, thank you very much for having me into your offices here at Westminster Abbey. It's a beautiful place, and I was able to take a bit of a walk around this morning and see the area and witness the Abbey in the early morning, which was beautiful. And you've been involved here at the Westminster Abbey, but can you tell me a little bit about your role here before we get into some of the other aspects of our discussion?
Well, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you very much for coming to visit. I'm the founder-director of Westminster Abbey Institute, which was created 10 years ago to nurture and revitalise moral and spiritual values in public life and service. So we have this geographical reality of Westminster Abbey sitting on one side of Parliament Square, with the Houses of Parliament to its right, the Supreme Court to its left, and the Treasury and all of Whitehall, the civil service, facing it. So on three sides of the square are the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, and then there's this great big old church on the fourth side, which actually got there first. And indeed the other institutions are there because the church is there, because that's where the king gathered his advisors in 1,000 years ago. And so the Institute is something of an answer to the question, what can Westminster Abbey do to support people in public life who are trying to rule and run the country such that their service will be all the greater, all the better, all the deeper. And we have public programmes, we also have private conversations and a fellows programme for younger public servants to just grow that moral character and resilience in what is a pretty brutal environment and a tough one to stay morally tuned in.
And how do you go about sort of A, identifying what some of the issues are in those institutions, and then B, going ahead and doing what you can to try and fix as much as you can some of those problems?
Well, we do it by talking to people. That's how we began, because Westminster is heaving with institutes. There really was a question as to whether Westminster needed another institute.
Need another institute.
And so I asked people if there was something that Westminster Abbey could do, people who work in these institutions, if there was something Westminster Abbey could do that wasn't being done perfectly well already. And the response was a very powerful yes, to be a place of reflection, a place where people can step back and think more deeply about the good they hope they're doing, that they came into public service to do, but are so busy doing it often lose sight of it, to reconnect to the vocation to public service, and also, because the Abbey is 1,000 years old, to get a sense of perspective. So I don't know what we were quarrelling about in 2012-13 when we were setting up the Institute, but we definitely thought everything was going wrong. But things have gone wrong before, and they've gone more wrong before. It's quite hard to think of something worse, for example, than the Civil War, when we chopped the king's head off. So even though things seem to have got even worse since 2012, they're still not as bad as the Civil War. So that's not to say it's all right and we don't have to be concerned about where things are, but there is a sense of perspective, and that gives the individuals who come and work with us less of this awful feeling that the whole burden is on their shoulders. So we didn't found the Institute on a narrative of crisis. We don't think of ourselves as trying to fix anything, but rather support the good that's around the place. And people tell us what they want to talk about. Often it's things like the role of the civil servant who's appointed on merit, not a political appointee in the UK. That's how the Constitution works. But they do have to enact the will of the democratically elected minister, because this is a democracy. But they do also have their own moral judgment. And because they're independently appointed, they are custodians of propriety. So they have to hold on to that moral sense, but they can't just say, well, I'm going to do what I think's right and not what the minister thinks right, because this is a democracy. So we talk about that interesting, quite uncomfortable moral space in which civil servants operate. For example, we talk about, we have public lectures on things like the nature of power around the square, power of politicians, power of civil servants, power of judges, power of journalists. We talk about integrity and truth and justice and trust in public life. And then the Fellows Programme, where we bring 15 or so younger public servants together for a year. We have residentials where we really work hard to try and help grow an inner strength for people so that they can operate well and with integrity.
And is there when you're getting into the public service, you are taking a foot into that government realm, and the UK is obviously a secular country as much as the head of state is also the head of the church here. What extent do you bring a religious perspective into some of those conversations, if at all?
Yes, good question, because this is Westminster Abbey, after all. It's a Christian church. Well, first of all, we can't deny the fact that we're a Christian church, so from a point of view of authenticity and our own integrity, that's what we say, and we don't in any way try and pretend that we're not that, or try and turn ourselves into something secular in order to be, more acceptable to our audiences. But we are also absolutely focused on being there for people of all faiths and no faith. The support is for people in public service. And indeed, the people who have a faith perhaps need this less because they have something to turn to where they can reconnect with their interior selves and their character in a way that secular people don't necessarily. I mean, they might have something, but they often don't, I find. And actually, I find people of faith don't either. There's a real thirst for depth around here. And we're surrounded by people who are really good people, who really want to do the right thing and feel as though they're pushed hither and yon. And so what we do is we take you might say, the treasures of the Christian tradition and bring them out into this space. And you have to translate outwards so that the language makes sense. It's a bit like a doctor having technical language where you've got to turn myocardial infarction into heart attack or something that the layperson can understand. So we take, divine inspiration, let's say, or the feeling of the Holy Spirit, language I might use, although I'm fairly cherry about using it at the best of times. But that sense of something coming alive in you. And it's possible to talk, and you're not even in your mind really thinking, oh, this is the Holy Spirit. It's just you see something coming alive in somebody because you're bringing something of what Westminster Abbey stands for into the conversation. Not explicitly, as I say, but the spirit of it is there. And it seems to work. Right,
so you bring that sort of religious aspect, and not necessarily coach it in any sort of guise, but there's some of those principles which I would think are sort of foundational to our society anyway. Yes. which you can rely on.
Yes, so the really lovely thing about this job is Westminster Abbey speaks for itself. So when you bring people into Westminster Abbey, and we have various beautiful old rooms where we have our sessions and chapels, it is not odd that people should be talking about what is the right thing to do, or trying to reconnect with the better angels of their nature. And indeed, you find if people want to say something really idealistic and they mean it, in this space, it doesn't sound like platitudes. It's heard in a space that's friendly to people striving to do their best. And that all happens by virtue of the space, not because of anything anybody says. It's quite magical.
You mentioned medical language, and I know that this is not your first sort of foray into this type of work before. Can you talk to me a little bit about your career before the Westminster Institute and the sort of similarities and or differences that you found in those earlier roles that you had?
Yes. Well, my first incarnation was as a research fellow at King's College London in the Centre of Medical Law and Ethics, where I was in charge of a project looking at the ethics of medical research on humans. This was in the 90s, when there were some ethics committees around the country scrutinising proposals to do medical research involving human subjects, but not many, and it was quite it kind of depended where you were, what level of scrutiny there was. There was no requirement for it. And I worked with the Department of Health and my colleagues in philosophy. I mean, I read theology, but I learned moral philosophy in this territory, which was an entirely secular territory, incidentally. In fact, there was a real anti-religion feeling there, as if religion really didn't help in medical ethics. And frankly, I'm not surprised, because the impression religion can often give when it comes to issues in medicine is they just say no. No to abortion, no to embryo research, no to end-of-life, to assisted dying, no to everything, and not get involved in the conversation. Now, as a matter of fact, that's not true, but that was the impression. That's the impression if you're outside that world, and that was certainly the feeling in the centre. So I left my theology at the door, but what I learned was some really robust moral philosophy, which I applied to the ethics of medical research on humans, and helped the Department of Health set up ethics committees to apply these principles. And actually there weren't so much principles as questions. So, and I still use this today.
By questions, you mean like a framework?
Yes.
Yeah.
So when you're thinking about whether something you're proposing to do is right or not, and this could apply to any policy area, you need to think of it not just in what it's trying to achieve. Yes, that's one moral question. Is the goal of this research project, this action, good? And you want to think about whether it is or not. And you want to think about whether the thing that you're going to do is going to achieve that goal. That's one moral question. The second moral question, which is more of a duty-based question, is what is it that you have to do in order to achieve this goal? And is it all right? Not do the ends justify the means, but is it all right in and of itself? So in the context of medical research on humans, you want to find a cure for cancer. Who could argue with that as a good goal? But the research that you need to do in order to find that cure for a particular cancer, let's say, will involve randomly allocating patients to different treatment. It might involve introducing a placebo to make it scientifically robust. Is that okay? For this group of patients, is that okay to do that to them? And you have to, as it were, pull back from the zeal of the goal. And politicians need to do this too. Pull back from the zeal of the goal and think, is it right to do whatever we have to do? We want to lay a high-speed track to Birmingham so people can get to Birmingham more quickly from London. Okay, that's maybe a good goal. We can even argue about that. But what you have to do in order to get there, there's a lot there, destroying habitats of humans as well as creatures, for example. So how you get there, that's the duty-based question. And then the third set of questions are what you might call the right-based questions, or rights-based questions. And these are, even if the goal is good, even if what you're going to do to achieve the goal is okay and not going to harm anybody, are the people most concerned with it happy with it? You have to ask consent too. And in the medical profession, certainly in the 90s, there was such a notion that the doctor knew best. So if you told the patient, you were going to do something, the patient would say, "Oh yes, doctor, we talked about doctor's orders."
Yeah.
Well, during the 90s, thank heavens, there was this rise of an understanding of the need to respect the patient's autonomy, because only the patient knew their own body, and they needed to be able to say no to things. And there might be for reasons that you, the doctor, would have no understanding of, and might even seem irrational to you, but they'd have their own reasons for saying, "No, I don't want you to do this." So seeking consent is a really critical third part of this moral framework. So goal-based, duty-based, right-based. And as I say, I still use that framework today. So I did that in the 90s. And then in the noughties, I was involved in medical ethics, advising the Church of England on medical ethics, but also trying to get it to take the environment seriously. So I had a glorious 10 years of working out a theology of the environment that would persuade Christians, the Church of England, that this was core Christian business to be concerned for the environment. These days, and I regard this as a mark of success, these days people don't really question that. Of course we should be concerned about the environment if we're Christians, if we care. But at the turn of the century and in the noughties, lots of Christians thought, well, Jesus just came to humans, so really, we're not interested in the environment. That's for tree huggers. That's for pagans. So I had a lot of fun reorienting that perception. Really a lot of fun. And it was lively theology, that. And I also became a lay canon at St Paul's Cathedral and helped set up an institute there for St Paul's Cathedral to relate to its neighbours in the city, the financial district. And that's really why I was asked to come and help here.
It sounds like moral teaching, moral ethics, and dare I say moral theology has been sort of the guiding principle of that career trajectory, let's say.
It is, but I didn't plan it, Jack. I had no idea when I left university what I was going to do, but things have sort of unfolded in this way.
Yeah,
gloriously.
Well, right. So there was no point at which you were going to set yourself on that path and just sort of blaze through that, but there must have been some foundation in which you felt comfortable to be able to go to King's College and say, yes, I feel able to work on medical ethics and these sorts of questions.
I never.
Or was there the imposter syndrome even
always,
even in the application?
Also, well, I suppose most of the jobs I've done didn't exist before I did them, so I was making it up as I went along, but that's a lovely, lovely way to work. Because, there's a poet who says, if you can see more than 2 steps ahead, it's not your path, because you're treading a path that's already been laid. And this has felt as though the path has opened up in front of me, and I've had to learn as I go along, and so I've had to be so open to encounter and to learning and to the need, to responding to the need, rather than thinking I have something that people need. It's more, what is your need and how can I serve it? But yes, it has always been in the area of ethics, as it's turned out.
We've sort of been focusing on your career, but if I may, I'd like to take a little pivot onto more of a personal perspective, and which there's a bit of a segue here, I think. You did your postdoctoral research work on Julian of Norwich. Were you born into a sort of Christian family and had sort of that background, or did you develop as a younger woman that interest in religion and religious ideas that led you to then do that postdoctoral work?
It was my doctorate, actually.
Sorry, your doctorate. Yeah.
I was born into a family that was nominally Church of England, although my father was of Jewish heritage, but his mother wasn't Jewish, so he wasn't actually Jewish. But we are all a quarter Jewish, and that's a strong thread in our family, but it's not acknowledged to be Jewish because my mother wasn't Jewish either. So there was that. We were all christened into the Church of England, and like lots of families at the time, we went to church at Christmas and sometimes at Easter. I do remember as a young child watching my mother go up to receive communion on Christmas Day and thinking, I want to go where you're going. And that was, I don't know, that might have just been because I wanted to follow my mother.
Yeah.
But there was something that intrigued me there. And my mother died when I was 12. And found myself reading the Bible from cover to cover. I went and found a church that I felt comfortable in, and I went to the early morning, beautiful, poetic Book of Common Prayer without really understanding its theology, a service every Sunday all through my teens, and ended up reading theology. So I've clearly always been interested in religion. But there was another massive strand in our family, which was that my parents belonged and put us in when we were children to an organisation which was one of these new religions. It wouldn't want itself to be called a religion, but it is really a new religion that was founded after the Second World War, when people had this wrenching experience of the Second World War, and the Church of England just wasn't cutting it. People wanted more alive spirituality, you might say, and the Church of England was just carrying on with its hymns and its stuff. So a lot of people looked east. So think of the Beatles and the Maharishi, and he brought meditation and transcendental meditation to the West. And this organisation, in that I learned to meditate. I learned mantra meditation. I learned Sanskrit. I read the Upanishads and the Gita. I was hugely influenced by Eastern philosophy, which teaches that we are all one. There is a single consciousness, and our goal of our life is to realise that is our true nature. But the thing about, and I stayed in that for quite a long time, but the thing about that whole setup, and it was an organisation, it was quite culty, hard to leave, involved you in lots and lots of things, so you were kept quite busy. There wasn't much love. And when my mother died, I thought we weren't supposed to grieve, because that was in some way being too attached to her. And the way you achieve full self-realisation is by being detached. And I have paid the price of not grieving properly for my mother ever since. Lots of therapy. So I guess there's been loads of religious and philosophical questions in my life right from the very start.
And then how did you come across Julian?
So Julian was the bright star in my very dry theology degree at Oxford. It was a special subject, the medieval mystics, and she was the best of the medieval mystics as well, but that was the best term of the whole 3 years. I think because she didn't try to organise God. Her writing is so fresh and alive, and it's not worked out. It's not an argument about the nature of God and the nature of creation that you can agree or disagree with. She had these visions, and she tells you what she saw and the musings that she had as she started to write about what she saw. And it's alive, and she brings you to life, and she's so charming and modest. That's where I met her, and that's where I fell in love with her.
And honest, the
Yes.
way that she goes through her descriptions and presents herself
Yes.
to the reader. But your PhD was also mixed in with some of the things that we were talking about earlier, what people term now the climate crisis, but also that environmentalism.
Yeah.
Can you tell me just a little bit about what your PhD focused on?
Yes, so of course I'd had these time with the Church of England thinking about the environment, so it had become a really important issue for me, and I better understood it. And I loved Julian, and I thought Julian must have something to teach us here. That was a strange thought, because if you're going to go medieval, you might go to St. Francis, for example. He's more obviously one who speaks about the environment and is tuned into the environment. But what I found as I looked at what she wrote, and not so much what she wrote, but the way she wrote, was that she had something to tell us about not so much what we should think or what we should do about the environmental crisis, but how we should be. So her way of being absolutely porous and open to her revelations and receiving them and participating in them and allowing herself to be transformed by them, that's what I think we need. We need a transformation. This is what the doctorate's about. We need a transformation of our subjectivity so that we're no longer enslaved by our inheritance of the Enlightenment, which of course brought many, many good things, and the Industrial Revolution. But that way of thinking, which is essentially to objectify and control nature and frankly each other, and be a separated individual who forms relationship one by one by one by one by one. We have to somehow free ourselves from that and see just how interdependent we are, how fundamentally relational we are, and look at nature and creation with those eyes, and then see what we can do. At the moment, we're still trying to fix things, control things. Fantastic technological solutions, but if they're applied with that same Industrial Revolution controlling mindset, we're going to be in trouble again. I'm quite sure of it, because we're not listening to the earth. We're just thinking, oh, this is good, need to stop so much rainfall here, or make more here, or cool things down, and it's an understandable approach, because it's something we can do, and we desperately want to do something. But the problem's so much bigger than that. It just is so much bigger and more complex than that. It's too big and too complex for any individual. So we can't have heroes now. We can't have individuals who lead us and take control and make it all work. We all have to soften and respond and listen, as good farmers do, to the earth, and serve it, not control it, not try and adapt it to our needs, but adapt our needs to it.
And what does Julian teach us about doing that?
Yes, well, it's this porosity. That's really the thesis is called Restoring Porosity. Is she by encounter with her text, as she encountered her visions and was transformed by them, so we can encounter her text and be transformed by it into this porous way of being. I'm not suggesting it's only by encountering Julian's text, and you have to encounter it as a disciple, by the way, but it could be...
What do you mean by that, sorry?
So you come to it not as a critic, actually not as a typical academic. You're not trying to agree or disagree with her. You're receiving her. You're porous to her. You're a disciple. You're there to learn. And you come to her text with that attitude, allow it to transform you, and that transforms your very subjectivity so that you see the world differently and respond to it differently. You respond as a servant, not as a rogue master, which is what we currently think. We think we're masters, we're actually rogue masters. We're not really masters at all.
Yes. And to take sort of an extension of that, people come with that porosity to Julian's text, but I suppose you can also come with that porosity to the environment itself.
Yes.
And as you were sort of saying, do that, just that listening exercise.
Yes, exactly. So she's an example. She's someone who can show us, but she's not the only one. But she did do that, and there's a lot in there. She talks a lot about woundedness, for example, her own woundedness, the wounds of Christ, and the porosity that allows. If we're wounded to each other, if we're vulnerable to each other. You see, this is such a massive problem, this ecological crisis, and we have caused so much of it, unwittingly. If we could only accept the size of it, accept our responsibility, recognise our helplessness, feel penitent, have humility, there's a chance we might learn. All the time we're trying to take control of it, we're not learning, we're not listening. And she shows us how to do that.
Yeah, because a lot of the things that people are trying to do is create new ways of making energy and those sorts of things, instead of what's our role in this?
Yes.
And how are we engaged with it all?
Yes, I don't want to suggest that we shouldn't find new clean ways of making
energy.
energy.
Sure.
I'm really not. But it's the way we do it.
Yeah.
Not in order to have all the energy we've wanted whenever we wanted it, which is what in the West, frankly, we've got used to.
Yes.
But something that means that we're not so greedy.
Yeah. Now, you've been an academic involved in public life. You've authored and been involved and edited several books. But I'd kind of like to talk about two of them, which is I, Julian, which came out earlier this year in April, and Miles to Go Before I Sleep, which is your letters that you wrote to various friends and colleagues during your cancer diagnosis and the process of that treatment. Starting off with Julian, but I'm sure we'll get on to Miles to Go Before I Sleep in that. Your approach in that book is it is unique. I don't think anyone else has done a fictional autobiography as Julian of Norwich, which I've found so fascinating. And I loved reading it because it really brought her to life. And after reading it, going back and reading her revelations gave just such a rounded perspective of those, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But to do that project and to take on the mind of a 14th century mystic who lived in such a tumultuous era and lived such a unique life must have been, in and of itself, quite a process. Can you talk me through a little bit about just the writing of the book itself and how you went about doing that?
I can only describe the beginnings of this book as a call to tell her story in the first person. And I do need to leap back to Miles to Go Before I Sleep in order to explain this, actually, because what happened was that, having completed the doctorate and done all this lovely work with Julian and made the argument for porosity, then I got this cancer diagnosis, and Julian stopped being the subject of my academic study and became my spiritual companion and friend through 2.5 years of grueling treatment. And she was so important to me in that way, and I absolutely was her disciple then. I had to call my own bluff, really, and it was so helpful. She taught me how to face pain. We can talk about that in a minute. But as I came out of the treatment, that's when I heard the call to tell her story, and I'd found this voice, the most truthful voice I've ever written in the letters to my friends that I'd written during the cancer treatment. I felt as though the cancer gave me my voice. And so the call was to tell Julian's story with that same profound honesty. And the only way to do that was to be I, for it to be first person. So I had to enter into her as fully as I could. And I would wake up, I would write early in the morning, before I did anything else practically, apart from make a cup of tea, sit up in bed and start to write, and the tips of my fingers, a bit like for a pianist, you have to keep your fingers short, on the keyboards, would tap away, and the words would come. And I know the text really, really well, so as it were, the research had been done. It wasn't just writing out of nowhere. But to connect with the woman who wrote that text and to tell her story, I don't think it was channeling. I've heard people talk about channeling, and it doesn't feel like that. It wasn't as if I disappeared, but it was more like something that Jeremy Irons said, who read it. He said it reminded him of when he acts. Say he's going to play King Lear. He'll do lots and lots of research, but then he lets go of the research and he simply enters into the part. And he says, I don't know where Jeremy Irons stops and King Lear starts. It's as if we become one, and that's what it felt like. So it would be like prayer also. I'd be going deep into myself for these words. So deep into myself, deep into Julian. It was the same place. So it was rather powerful and quite... I'd emerged from these writing sessions as if I'd been in some sort of very different, special, powerful place, blinking in the sunlight. There's a world out there which I've been completely away from, like Julian in her cell. It really was an extraordinary experience writing it.
Yes, because for those that aren't aware, Julian enclosed herself in a cell next to St Julian's Church in Norwich and lived as a anchoress, a recluse, without really any personal physical contact. That's an extraordinary thing to do. And I guess some of us got a bit of a feeling of that during COVID, but she was there for, 25, 30 years without being able to touch anyone else. That's a remarkable thing to do and to imagine in your case, and then write about as if you were in fact doing it.
Yes. I did want to try and make what she did make sense to a 21st century mind. And there are lots of echoes, surprising echoes between these two centuries, the 14th and the 21st, not least the pandemic, because the plague, or the pestilence as they called it, wave after wave came through the land at the time. There was war, there was heresy, which was stamped upon, and we don't have church heresy now, but we have other kinds of heresies which is stamped upon today. We're quite intolerant of each other, dreadfully intolerant of each other today. So there are lots of resonances across. So why would a person choose to go into a cell? And I love the way you picked up the fact that's what she didn't have, was physical touch. Because of course she did see people. People came and sought her advice. She could see into the church. There was a window into the church so she could participate in the mass. And her maid had a window to pass through food, and she could pass out her detritus.
Well, you say that in a very sort of closed way, but in the book you do go into some detail about what?
Constipation.
Her constipation,
yes.
and scooping it out.
Yes,
as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's from my own experience. If you read Miles to Go, you'll know that catastrophic constipation is catastrophic.
Yeah.
It's not a minor side effect. And I could never control the sickness from the chemotherapy. There was one very strong anti-sickness drug, and that gave me constipation. So having experienced that, I stopped taking it. So I was always sick. But so I gave Julian that experience. Also, the hot flush. I mean, there are lots of things I've drawn from my own experiences that are in her story. But actually, in the Ankreen Wis, the rule for anchoresses, it does talk about haircuts, and it says 4 times a year. So presumably, you'd have to lean your head out to have it cut, and there would be a little bit of touch there.
Yeah,
but that would be, vanishingly rare.
Mm-hmm. So you sort of touch upon there some of the things that Julian taught you, and you mentioned pain earlier. Can you go a little bit further into some of those that relationship back and forth between yourself and Julian?
Yes. So there I was having this treatment, and it was really, really hard, and it went on and on and on. And then in the middle of it, there was a stem cell transplant, which was the worst bit of all. That was where you're brought very close to death. Literally, they kill off all your bone marrow. So you have absolutely no immunity. Even your own bacteria is poisonous to you. So they put you in an isolation room and feed you with antibiotics to keep you alive. And it's absolutely horrible. And as I say, I never managed to control the sickness, so the chemotherapy through the rest of the time was also really horrible. And week after week after week, I'd have to go. And what I learned from Julian is, and this is her encounter with Christ on the cross, where she asks to experience his pains, is that pain, or it could be fear, has to be moved through, not pushed away, but moved through, and then you find joy. And again and again and again I found this. I would dress up for chemotherapy, wear really bright colours and lipstick, and walk towards the cancer centre, knowing what I was walking towards, dreading this tunnel of hard things, because you go in, have the treatment, and then you've got 24 hours, maybe 48 hours of sickness afterwards. Every week. Well, you have 1 week off every 3 weeks on, 1 week off, but that's practically every week. And I put a smile on my face, and I'd move towards this tunnel of hard things and enter the cancer centre, and in that, going to greet it rather than dreading it and pushing it away and not wanting to go, and moving into it porously, I would see as I entered, yes, lots of hard things, experience lots of hard things, but in the interstices there was so much beauty and love above all. You see someone with their beloved who's having the treatment, who's looking after them, a nurse doing something amazing, something brought tears to my eyes. I was walking past. There's a table in the middle of the cancer centre with things on it that you can do, like jigsaws and things like that. And I saw a man sitting there, and he was dressed in a suit and tie, quite thin and like a Dickens clerk or something. And he was doing a puzzle, kind of slowly, because you can't think, you can't do much when you're feeling really sick or anxious. And there he was. So there was that kind of thing. And you kept seeing, and because I was writing about it, I kept noticing these things to tell my dear readers. There was a woman called Brenda who I sat next to when we were waiting to have our bloods done. And gosh, she was quite old and wrinkly, but she was made up, and she had beautiful shellacked the nails, and I noticed her nails because she showed me how big the lymph node was. It's the size of my little fingernail. So I looked, and she thought she'd done her nails, and she got mascara on, and her eyes were so full of bravery. And here she was going to have some horrible treatment or other, and I just kept meeting this, and Julian teaching me to move towards it, open myself to it, be porous to it, not go with the fear, not go with the anger or the bitterness, go with the beauty, and it's there. It is there.
There's a beautiful passage in I, Julian, where you talk about her turmoil, where she sort of comes to the realisation that she's locked in this cell, she's questioning whether it's the right thing to do. You describe it as pacing back and forth like a caged animal. And in those events, which you say isn't a one-off, they're a recurring event and a recurring theme of her presence in the cell, was sort of reminded me of just that constant struggle that we all go through in every day. But in that, she prays, and then she comes to the realisation that she's good, and she comes back to that meditative state. And what you seem to be describing there about your treatments to the cancer village, as I believe you call it in the book.
I don't call it that. That's what guys call it.
Yeah.
Weird.
Yeah. Your descriptions of it, actually, I found quite funny.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
I didn't want to bore my readers.
No, it was hilarious. But yes, to call it a cancer village is I guess one way to put it. But there sounds in that description that constant struggle. Yes, everyone's going to face struggle, but there's the choice of perspective, and then there's the choice to move through it. Yes, instead of banging against it.
Yes, and I hope it was clear, actually, both in Miles to Go and in I, Julian, that these experiences are not. It's not just a matter of pulling yourself together and getting out of it. Sometimes you just have to go through it. I suppose that's what I mean by going through the pain. You have to go through, you have to suffer that feeling of utter abandonment and senselessness and claustrophobia in the case of the cell. It'd be about the size of this office, actually, her cell. Yeah. So you imagine her pacing backwards and forwards. I can't do the footage. I know this is a podcast, but you could maybe, is it 12, I don't know, is it 12 foot by 8 foot or 10 foot or something?
Yeah, I've actually got some. I went to the cell a few weeks ago and took some photos. So I'll put that up on the Instagram for anyone that wants to check those out. Yeah,
brilliant.
Yeah.
So you'll get a sense of this space. And she says, that it yes, it happened again and again. Not, I hope, too often. I recount it once in detail, and then you get the sense every now and then it comes, and that she learns that it's a kind of purging. It's a necessary, go back to constipation. It's a necessary, and she wakes up the following morning when it's finally gone, refreshed in a strange way, exhausted, but ready to almost renew her vow to stay solitary. And one of her visions is of this. So it's the seventh vision where she has this wonderful, she calls it sovereign likeness in her soul, liking in her soul, sovereign liking in her soul. And God is with her, and she's comfortable. She's not. Her body is comfortable, even though she's in the middle of this crisis of her fever. She's at peace. And then the next moment, she's absolutely ravaged by irritation. That's when I use my experience of hot flush to describe it. Everything is wrong. The maid is crashing about, making a racket. Her mother's trying to do something with her forehead, and she's hot, and the bedclothes are hot, and her body hurts, and God is nowhere to be found. And then the next moment, the peace comes back. And then the woe comes back. And then the wheel is a good one. 20 times. And she says, I did nothing to deserve the woe, and I did nothing to deserve the wheel. They just came. Back and forth, back and forth. And it seems to me that's a description of our lives. But she learned that, as a matter of fact, she is not abandoned by God, even though she can't see God. And one of her visions is about the fall, and how the fall in the garden is to a place where you fall so that you can't see God. You can't see that God still loves you. And that feeling of abandonment is her experience of the fall, Adam's fall.
The parable, which you're sort of talking about, is one of the aspects of Julian's writing that gets maybe the second most amount of attention after the "All shall be well" quote. And it's quite a remarkable parable that goes into the fall, as you mentioned. What do you think that parable has to teach us in sort of the present day about our continual struggle and our not turning away from, but incapacity to see God, let's say.
Or indeed each other.
Yeah.
Or the creation. Yes, I think it's extremely wise parable for our day. So when you think about the ecological crisis, it didn't happen because humanity said, we're going to really mess up the earth. Let's really deliberately heat it up, poison the water, destroy other species, mine all the oil and the coal out of the earth and suck it dry,
and then burn it everywhere,
and burn it and warm it up, heat it up the atmosphere, and farm and cultivate and cut down trees, and so heat up the earth and take away all her ability to cool herself. We didn't do that deliberately. We were just trying to feed ourselves. We were trying to, for so long, nature felt like an adversary that we had to try and make our best way through and survive. We're not able to run fast. We're not able to. We don't have fur to keep ourselves warm. We can't see that well. Our ears aren't that good, so we have to use our wits to make the environment give us what we needed, or find in the environment what we needed. But then, of course, technology and that feeling of being in control came along, and so things started to go wrong. But it wasn't deliberate. It wasn't a deliberate trashing of the planet. Nevertheless, that's what's happened. And the story of the traditional story of the fall is Adam and Eve's disobedience. That's what people say. It's humanity's disobedience. God gave them an instruction, they disobeyed it, and that's why we're all in the trouble we're in. And Julian says no. The fall happened because the servant, Adam, wanted to obey the Lord, and was in too much of a hurry to do so. And so my interpretation of that in I, Julian, is seeing a link with our hurry with production, so mass production, turning animals into and other humans into units of production, making the soil give and give and give, and the economy now demands that. So if farmers' margins are so slight, they have to have winter sowing and summer sowing and winter sowing and summer sowing, and bung in fertiliser to keep the soil fertile. And you think of a woman having baby after baby after baby after baby, and what that does to her body, like that, and the soil becomes sterile, because of all the rubbish that's been put in, the chemicals that have been put into it. So it's all in a great haste to be of service, actually. So it kind of reads across quite well to our time and what we're facing. And what importantly it doesn't do is introduce guilt, but more understanding. And so that feeling of falling into this ditch and being abandoned because you can't see God, you can't see that you're still loved. So you've got to work it all out for yourself. That's an enlightenment mindset. Got to work it out for myself. There's no help around here. And so you take control. To let go of that and, let's say, hope that you're loved, even if you can't feel it. Feel that you can love and serve, and that you're not alone, and that we are all in this together, and we need to work with each other and support all our endeavours.
Well, Claire, I think with those words, that's a really beautiful place to end our conversation, and I think it's a nice, hopeful message for how we can go about engaging with the world and learning from people such as Julian. I think in today's world there is a lot of hopelessness, especially in relation to the climate crisis. I think a lot of people don't know what they can do, what to expect, what the future holds. And so I think that provides a message of hope and a way to go about engaging with the world and with each other.
We should use our feeling of helplessness and let it make us soft and open, rather than hating it. Really feel the helplessness, because it's true. We are. So let it serve us to become what we need to become in order to be with the world as we should be today.
Yeah, good message. But thank you very much, Claire. Thank you for having me in your office.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for joining and listening.